As a boy, I not only wondered at the existence of the cosmos, I also wondered about how it began. I remember lying in bed at night trying to think of a beginningless universe. Every event would be preceded by another event, back and back into the past with no stopping point, or more accurately, no starting point. An infinite past with no beginning. My mind reeled at the prospect. It just seemed inconceivable to me. There must have been a beginning at some point, I thought, in order for everything to get started. Again, little did I realize that for centuries, millennia really, men had grappled with the idea of an infinite past and the question of whether there was an absolute beginning. Ancient Greek philosophers believed that matter was necessary and uncreated and therefore eternal. God may be responsible for introducing order into the cosmos, but he did not create the universe itself. This Greek view was in contrast to the ancient Jewish view about the subject. Hebrew writers held that the universe has not always existed, but was created by God at some point in the past. As the first verse of the Hebrew Holy Scriptures state, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Genesis 1:1. Eventually, these two competing traditions began to interact. There arose in Western philosophy an ongoing debate that lasted for well over 1,000 years as to whether or not the universe had a beginning. This debate played itself out among Jews and Muslims as well as Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. It finally sputtered to something of an inconclusive end in the thought of the great 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He held, ironically, that there are rationally compelling arguments for both sides, thereby exposing the bankruptcy of reason itself. I first became aware of this debate only after graduating from college. Having become a Christian my junior year in high school, I was soon faced with the decision of picking a college to attend. Sandy, the girl in my German class who first shared with me her faith in Christ, suggested that I apply to Wheaton College, where her older brother Paul was a student. Studying at a Christian college really appealed to me as a young believer, and so I applied and lo and behold was accepted to study at Wheaton. Now, you have to understand that I had never been a part of the Christian subculture before. And so attending Wheaton was for me like a taste of heaven. Professors who prayed before class. There was daily chapel. You never heard swearing or filthy talk in the locker room and so on. It was wonderful. But the truly priceless gift that Wheaton gave to me was the integration of my faith and learning. I saw that as a Christian, I didn't need to stick my brains in one pocket and my faith in the other pocket and never let them both see the light of day at the same time. Rather, I could have a Christian world view, a Christian perspective on science, a Christian perspective on history, a Christian perspective on literature, a Christian perspective on the arts, and so on. And it was at Wheaton that I got the vision of sharing my faith in the context of presenting an intellectual defense of the gospel to appeal to the head as well as to the heart. Unfortunately, Wheaton was surprisingly weak in apologetics. My theology professor, Robert Weber, taught us that there are no good arguments for God's existence and that the traditional proofs had all been refuted. Although I was skeptical about his claim, I more or less bought into what he said on the basis of his say-so. Then, just prior to graduating from Wheaton, I picked up a book by Stuart Hackett called The Resurrection of Theism on a clearance table at the college bookstore. I have to confess that at the time I wasn't even sure what the title meant. Later, during the fall, when I got around to reading the book, I was absolutely stunned by what I read. In contrast to what I had been taught at Wheaton, Hackett, with devastating logic, was defending arguments for God's existence and providing refutations of every conceivable objection to them. The centerpiece of Hackett's case was the argument that had seized me as a boy. It is rationally inconceivable that the series of past events be infinite. There must have been a beginning of the universe, and therefore a transcendent cause which brought it into being. Reading Hackett's book was a shocking, eye-opening experience for me. I had to find out if he was right. During my senior year at Wheaton, a chapel speaker named John Guest had challenged us seniors to take a couple of years out after graduation to share our faith with university students full-time while we were still about the same age. And that made sense to me, so I decided to put off my plans to go to seminary for 2 years and to join the staff of Campus Crusade for Christ. And I was assigned to the staff team at Northern Illinois University. One of the other members of the staff team was a young single woman named Jan Coleman, a graduate of the University of North Dakota. She was vivacious and outgoing and projected confidence, independence, and strength. She was sold out to Christ and committed to evangelism. Not only that, but with her slim figure and waist length, dark brown hair, and big brown eyes, she was really hot. She even told me that she wanted to go to seminary, precisely the place where I was headed. Well, a girl like this was way out of my league, but I couldn't help but be attracted to her. And miracles still happen. For us, I worked with the guys and she worked with the gals. We fell in love, and we were married by the end of that school year. We then set our sights on the master's degree program in philosophy of religion, spearheaded by Dr. Norman Geisler at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School north of Chicago. One of the program's entrance requirements was the graduate record exam in philosophy. So over the next year, in preparation for the exam, I read and took detailed notes on Frederick Copleston's monumental 9-volume history of philosophy. And it was there that I discovered the long history of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian thought about the argument which Hackett was defending. I determined that if I could ever do doctoral work in philosophy, I would write my PhD dissertation on this argument. Well, we spent 2 great years at Trinity, during which time I earned master's degrees in philosophy of religion and in church history. It was a crucial stepping stone in the path that God had set for us. In our life together as a married couple, the Lord has usually shown us only enough light along the path to take the very next step without knowing what lies further along the trail. So one evening, as Jan and I were nearing the end of our time at Trinity, we were sitting at the supper table talking about what to do after graduation, and neither of us had any clear idea or leading about what we should do. So Jan said to me, "Well, if money were no object, what would you really like to do next?" And I replied, "Well, if money were no object, I'd really like to go to England and do a doctorate under John Hick." And she said, "Who's he?" And I said, "Oh, he's this famous British philosopher who's written extensively on arguments for the existence of God. And if I could study with him, I could develop a cosmological argument for God's existence." But it hardly seemed like a realistic idea. Well, the next evening, Jan handed me a slip of paper with John Hick's address on it. She said, "I went to the library today and I found out that he's at the University of Birmingham in England. Why don't you write to him and ask him if you can do a doctoral thesis under him on the cosmological argument?" What a woman. So I did. And to our amazement and delight, Professor Hick wrote back saying he'd be very pleased to supervise my doctoral work on that subject. So it was an open door. The only problem was the University of Birmingham required an official banker's certification that we had all of the money for all of the years required that it would take to complete the doctoral program in philosophy at the University of Birmingham. They didn't want foreign students dropping out midway because they had run out of cash. Well, we didn't have that kind of money. In fact, we were as poor as church mice. Our little efficiency apartment at Trinity was so small that lying on our mattress on the floor, you could reach out and touch the refrigerator. It was all in one little room. In fact, we used to cut paper plates in half in order to cut down on expenses. That led to an embarrassing moment one evening when we had Dr. Geisler over for dessert. And Jan, not even thinking about it, served him his piece of pie on half a paper plate. Well, gracious to a fault, he never even said a thing, but just ate his dessert. But we really sensed that God was calling us to go to England to do that doctoral degree. There weren't any scholarships for foreign students at that time from financially strapped British universities, so we had to come up with the money ourselves. So every morning and every evening we began to pray that the Lord would supply all of this money to do this doctoral study in Great Britain. Well, to make a long story short, we made an appointment with a non-Christian businessman whose family had supported Jan on campus crusade staff, and we laid out for him what we believed God was calling us to do. And this non-Christian businessman gave us, not loaned us, he gave us all of the money for all of the years that we would need to complete the doctoral study under John Hick at the University of Birmingham. It was one of the most astonishing provisions of the Lord that I have ever seen in my life. So Jan and I felt as though God had just miraculously plucked us up and transported us to England to do this degree. I did write on the cosmological argument under Professor Hick's direction, and eventually 3 books flowed out of that doctoral dissertation. I was able to explore the historical roots of Hackett's argument, as well as to deepen and advance his analysis. I also discovered quite amazing connections to contemporary astronomy and astrophysics. Because of its historic roots in medieval Islamic theology, I christened the argument the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Kalam is the Arabic word for medieval theology. Today, this argument, largely forgotten since the time of Kant, is once again back at center stage. The Cambridge Companion to Atheism of 2007 reports, and I quote, "A count of the articles in philosophy journals shows that more articles have been published about Craig's defense of the Kalam argument than have been published about any other philosopher's contemporary formulation of an argument for God's existence. Theists and atheists alike cannot leave Craig's Kalam argument alone." So we thank the Lord for the privilege of studying this historic argument. And in the following lecture, I want to share it with you. The title of this lecture is "Why Did the Universe Begin?" What is the Kalam Cosmological Argument? Let's allow one of its greatest medieval champions to speak for himself. Al-Ghazali was a 12th century Muslim theologian from Persia, or modern-day Iran. He was concerned that Muslim philosophers of his day were being influenced by ancient Greek philosophy to deny God's creation of the universe. They held that the universe flows necessarily out of God and is therefore beginningless. After thoroughly studying the teachings of these philosophers, Al-Ghazali wrote a withering critique of their views entitled "The Incoherence of the Philosophers." In this fascinating book, he argues that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd, the universe must have a beginning, and since nothing begins to exist without a cause, there must be a transcendent creator of the universe. Al-Ghazali frames his argument very simply, I quote, "Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning." So, once again, we can summarize Al-Ghazali's argument in three simple, easily memorizable steps. One, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Two, the universe began to exist. Three, therefore, the universe has a cause. This argument is so marvelously simple that it's easy to memorize and share with another person. It's also a logically airtight argument. If the two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So anybody who wants to deny the conclusion has to regard either premise 1 or premise 2 as false. So the whole question is it more probable that these statements are true or that they are false? Let's examine each premise in turn. I think that the first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, is virtually undeniable for any sincere seeker after truth. For something to come into being without any cause whatsoever would be to come into being from nothing. But that is surely impossible. Let me give three reasons in support of this premise. Number one, something cannot come from nothing. To claim that something can come into being from nothing is worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. But if you deny premise 1, you've got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. But nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause. This isn't rocket science. In The Sound of Music, when Captain Von Trapp and Maria reveal their love for each other, what does Maria say? Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. Now, we don't normally think of philosophical principles as romantic, but Maria was here expressing a fundamental truth of classical metaphysics. No doubt she had been well trained in classical philosophy at the convent school. Now, sometimes skeptics will respond to this point by saying that in physics, subatomic particles, so-called virtual particles, come into being from nothing. Or certain theories of the origin of the universe are sometimes described in popular magazines as getting something from nothing, so that the universe is the exception to the proverb, there ain't no free lunch. This skeptical response represents, I believe, a deliberate abuse of science. The theories in question have to do with particles or the universes originating as a fluctuation of the energy contained in the vacuum. The vacuum in modern physics is not what laymen understand by vacuum, namely nothing. Rather, in physics, the vacuum is a sea of fluctuating energy governed by physical laws and having a physical structure. To tell laymen that on such theories something comes from nothing is a distortion of those theories. And there is, by the way, a lesson in this. You have to be very, very leery of popular articles and television shows on scientific theories. In order to communicate these highly technical theories to laymen, writers inevitably have to resort to metaphors and word pictures that can be grossly misleading and inaccurate. And the claim that physics shows that something can come from nothing is a case in point. Properly understood, nothing does not mean just empty space. Nothing is the absence of anything whatsoever, even space itself. As such, nothingness literally has no properties at all, since there isn't anything to have any properties. How silly then, when popularizers say things like nothingness is unstable to quantum fluctuations, or the universe tunneled into being out of nothing. When I first published my work on the Kalam Cosmological Argument in 1979, I figured that atheists would attack premise 2 of the argument, that the universe began to exist. But I didn't think that they'd go after premise 1, for that would make them look like people not sincerely seeking after truth, but just looking for an academic refutation of the argument. What a surprise, then, to hear atheists denying premise 1 in order to escape the argument. For example, Quentin Smith of the University of Western Michigan responded that the most rational position to hold is that the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Sort of a good conclusion to a Gettysburg Address of atheism, perhaps. This is simply the faith of an atheist. In fact, I think this represents a greater leap of faith than belief in the existence of God. For it is, I repeat, literally worse than magic. If this is the alternative to belief in God, then unbelievers can never accuse believers of irrationality. For nothing, I think, could be more evidently irrational than this. Number 2, if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer just pop into being from nothing? Why is it only universes that can come into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? There can't be anything about nothingness that favors universes, for nothingness doesn't have any properties. Nor can anything constrain nothingness, for there isn't anything to be constrained. I've heard atheists respond to this argument by saying that premise 1 is true of everything in the universe, but not of the universe. But this is just the old taxicab fallacy that we encountered in Leibniz's argument. You can't dismiss the causal principle like a cab once you get to the universe. Premise 1 is not merely a law of nature, like the law of gravity, which only applies in the universe. Rather, it's a metaphysical principle that governs all of being, all of reality. At this point, the atheist is likely to retort, all right, if everything has a cause, what is God's cause? I'm always amazed at the self-congratulatory attitude with which students pose this question. They imagine that they've said something important or profound, when all they've done is misunderstand the premise. Premise 1 does not say that everything has a cause. Rather, it says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something that is eternal wouldn't need a cause because it never came into being. Al-Ghazali would therefore respond that God is eternal and uncaused. And this is not special pleading for God, since this is exactly what the atheist has traditionally said about the universe. It is eternal and uncaused. The problem is that we have good evidence that the universe is not eternal, but had a beginning. And so the atheist is backed into the corner of saying that the universe sprang into being without a cause, which is absurd. 3, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. Premise 1 is constantly verified and never falsified. It's hard to understand how any atheist committed to modern science could deny that premise 1 is more plausibly true than false in light of the evidence. So I think that the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is clearly true. If the price of denying the argument's conclusion is denying premise 1, then atheism is, I think, philosophically bankrupt. The more controversial premise in the argument is premise 2, that the universe began to exist. Let me present 2 philosophical arguments and 2 scientific arguments in defense of this premise. First, the philosophical arguments. Al-Ghazali argued that if the universe never began to exist, then there have been an infinite number of past events prior to today. But, he argued, an infinite number of things cannot exist. Al-Ghazali recognized that a potentially infinite number of things could exist, but he denied that an actually infinite number of things could exist. Let me explain the difference. When we say that something is potentially infinite, infinity serves merely as an ideal limit which is never reached. For example, you could divide any finite distance in half, and then into fourths, and then into eighths, and then into sixteenths, and so on to infinity. The number of divisions is potentially infinite, and in that sense you could keep on dividing endlessly. But you would never arrive at an infinity-f division. You would never have an actually infinite number of parts or divisions. Now, Al-Ghazali has no problem with the existence of a potentially infinite number of things, for these are just ideal limits. But he argued that if an actually infinite number of things could exist, then various absurdities would result. If we're to avoid these absurdities, then we must deny that an actually infinite number of things exist. And that would mean that the number of past events cannot be actually infinite, and therefore the universe cannot be beginningless. Rather, the universe began to exist. Now, it's very frequently alleged that this kind of argument has been invalidated by developments in modern mathematics. In modern set theory, the use of actually infinite sets is commonplace. For example, the set of natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth, is actually infinite. It is not merely potentially infinite, according to modern set theory. Rather, the number of members in this set is actually infinite. There are an actually infinite number of natural numbers. And many people have mistakenly inferred that these mathematical developments undermine Al-Ghazali's argument. But these developments in modern mathematics merely showed that if you adopt certain axioms and conventions, then you can talk about actually infinite collections in a consistent way without contradicting yourself. All this accomplishes is showing how to set up a certain universe of discourse for talking consistently about actual infinites. But it does absolutely nothing to show that the mathematical entities really exist, or that an actually infinite number of things can really exist. If Al-Ghazali is right, then this universe of discourse can be regarded as just a fictional realm, like the world of Sherlock Holmes, or something that exists only in your mind. Moreover, Al-Ghazali's claim is not that the existence of an actually infinite number of things involves a logical contradiction, but that it is really impossible. To give an analogy, the claim that something came into existence out of nothing, uncaused, is not strictly logically contradictory, but nevertheless it is really impossible. These modern mathematical developments, far from undermining Al-Ghazali's argument, can actually strengthen it by providing us insight into the strange nature of the actual infinite. The way in which Al-Ghazali brings out the real impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences. Let me share one of my favorite illustrations called Hilbert's Hotel, after the great German mathematician David Hilbert. Hilbert first invites us to imagine an ordinary hotel with a finite number of rooms. Suppose, furthermore, that all the rooms are occupied. If a new guest shows up at the desk asking for a room, the manager says, "Sorry, all the rooms are occupied," and that's the end of the story. But now, says Hilbert, let's imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, and let's suppose once again that all the rooms are occupied. This fact has to be clearly appreciated. There is not a single vacancy throughout the entire infinite hotel. Every room already has somebody in it. Now suppose a new guest shows up at the front desk asking for a room. "No problem," says the manager. And he moves the person who was staying in room number 1 into room number 2. The person who was staying in room number 2 into room number 3. The person who was staying in room number 3 into room number 4, and so on out to infinity. As a result of these room changes, room number 1 now becomes vacant, and the new guest gratefully checks in. But remember, before he arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even worse. Let's now suppose, Hilbert says, that an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk asking for rooms. "No problem," says the manager. And he moves the person who was staying in room number 1 into room number 2. The person who was in room number 2 into room number 4. The person who was in number 3 into room number 6, each time moving each person into the room number twice his former room. Now, since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all of the guests wind up in the even-numbered rooms. As a result, all of the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests is easily accommodated. In fact, the manager could do this an infinite number of times and always accommodate infinitely more guests. And yet, before they arrived, the hotel was already full. As a student once remarked to me, Hilbert's hotel, if it could exist, would have to have a sign posted outside. "No vacancy. Guests welcome." But Hilbert's hotel is even stranger than the great German mathematician made it out to be. For just ask yourself the question, what would happen if some of the guests start to check out? Suppose all of the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out of the hotel. In this case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel, indeed as many as remained behind. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. The number is just infinite. Now, suppose the manager doesn't like having a half-empty hotel. It looks bad for business. No matter. By moving the guests as before, only this time in reverse order, he converts his half-empty hotel into one that is bursting at the seams. Now, you might think that by these maneuvers, the manager could always manage to keep this strange hotel fully occupied. But you'd be wrong. For suppose the guests in room numbers 4, 5, 6, and so on check out. At a single stroke, the hotel would be virtually emptied, the guest register reduced to but 3 names, and the infinite converted into finitude. And yet, it would be true that the same number of guests checked out this time as when all of the odd-numbered guests checked out. Can anybody believe that such a hotel can exist in reality? Hilbert's hotel is absurd. Now, since nothing hangs on the illustrations involving a hotel, the argument can be generalized to show that the existence of an actually infinite number of things is absurd. Sometimes people react to Hilbert's hotel by saying that these absurdities result because the concept of infinity is beyond us and we don't really understand it. But this reaction is mistaken and naive. As I said, infinite set theory is a highly developed and well understood branch of mathematics. And these absurdities result because we do understand the nature of the actual infinite. Hilbert was a very smart guy, and he knew very well how to illustrate the bizarre consequences of the existence of an actually infinite number of things. Really, the only thing that the critic can do at this point is to just bite the bullet and say that a Hilbert's hotel is not absurd. Sometimes critics will try to justify this move by saying that if an actual infinite could exist, then such situations are exactly what we should expect. But this justification is inadequate. Hilbert would of course agree that if an actual infinite could exist, then the situation with his imaginary hotel is what we should expect. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good illustration. But the question is whether such a hotel is really possible. Moreover, the critics can't just bite the bullet when it comes to situations like the guests checking out of the hotel. For here, we do have a logical contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities, and we come up with non-identical results. And that's why subtraction of infinity from infinity is mathematically prohibited. But while we may slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to break the rules, we can't stop real people from checking out of a hotel. So I think Al-Ghazali's first argument is a good one. It shows that the number of past events must be finite, and therefore the universe must have had a beginning. Now, Al-Ghazali had a second independent argument for the beginning of the universe. So those who deny that the universe began to exist have to refute not only his first argument, but his second one as well, since it's independent of the first one. The series of past events, Al-Ghazali observes, has been formed by adding one member after another. The series of past events is like a sequence of dominoes falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. But he argues no series which is formed by adding one member after another can be actually infinite. For you cannot pass through an actually infinite number of elements one at a time. Now this is very easy to see in the case of trying to count to infinity. No matter how high you count, there will always be an infinity of numbers left to count. But if you can't count to infinity, how could you count down from infinity? This would be like someone's claiming to have counted down all of the negative numbers, ending at 0, -3, -2, -1, 0. This seems crazy. For before he could count 0, he would have to count -1. And before he could count -1, he would have to count -2. And before he could count -2, he would have to count -3, and so on back to infinity. Before any number could be counted, an infinity of numbers will have to have been counted first. You just get driven back and back into the past so that no number could ever be counted. But then the final domino, so to speak, could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously here we are. That shows that the series of past events must be finite and have a beginning. Some critics have responded to this argument by pointing out that even in a beginningless past, every event in the past is only a finite distance from the present. Compare the series of negative numbers. -3, -2, -1, until you finally come to 0. Now, even though the series of negative numbers is infinite and beginningless, nevertheless, any number you pick, say negative 11 or negative 1 billion or whatever, any number you pick, n, will be only a finite distance from 0. But the finite distance from any past event to the present is easily crossed, just as you can count down to 0 from any negative number that you pick. This objection commits a logical fallacy called the fallacy of composition. This is the fallacy of confusing a property of a part with a property of the whole. For example, every part of an elephant may be light in weight, but that doesn't mean that the whole elephant is light in weight. In the case at hand, just because every finite part of a series can be counted down or crossed, doesn't mean that the whole infinite series can be counted down or crossed. The critics have committed an elementary logical fallacy. The question is not how any finite part of the past can be formed by adding one event after another, but how the whole beginningless past could be completed by adding one event after another. Al-Ghazali sought to heighten the absurdity of forming an infinite past by giving illustrations of various absurd situations that would result if it could be done. For example, suppose that for every one orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, they will approach a limit at which Saturn is infinitely far behind Jupiter. Of course, they'll never actually arrive at that limit. But now turn the story around. Suppose Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Which will have completed the most orbits? Well, the answer is that the number of their orbits is exactly the same. Infinity. Now, don't let somebody try to slip out of this argument by telling you that infinity is not a number. In modern mathematics, it is a number. It is the number of the elements in the set of natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So the number of the orbits completed by Jupiter and Saturn is exactly the same. Infinity, even though for every orbit that that Jupiter completes, or rather the Saturn completes, Jupiter is completed 2. And that seems absurd because the longer they orbit, the greater the disparity between them goes. So how does the number of orbits magically become equal by making them orbit from eternity past? Another illustration. Suppose we meet someone who claims to have been counting down from eternity past and is now finishing. -3, -2, -1, 0. Why, we may ask, is he just finishing his countdown today? Why didn't he finish yesterday? Or the day before that? After all, by then an infinite amount of time had already elapsed. So if the man were counting at the rate of 1 number per second, he's already had an infinite number of seconds to finish his countdown. He should already be done. In fact, at any point in the past, he has already had infinite time, and so should already be finished. But then at no point in the past can we find the man finishing his countdown, which contradicts the hypothesis that he has been counting down from eternity. These illustrations only strengthen Al-Ghazali's claim that no series which is formed by adding one member after another can be actually infinite. Since the series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another, it cannot be actually infinite. It must have had a beginning. And so we have a second good argument for premise 2 of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, that the universe began to exist. Now, before I share with you the scientific arguments in favor of this premise, let me ask if there are any questions about the philosophical arguments that we've just shared.